And the way I explain it is, so David, if I asked you what you ate for dinner last night, can you tell me what you ate for dinner? What
Mhm. Chicken and fries.
So when I asked you that, you saw pictures, right, of what you ate,
Yeah.
probably maybe where you ate it. That's how you stored the information about dinner last night. It wasn't traumatic or disturbing, so it's stored as a fairly low resolution file. Had that been a traumatic event, all your senses are heightened: sight, smell, hearing. It's going to record that in high definition with tremendous amounts of details to it. Whenever your mind recalls that traumatic information, it thinks it's happening now. It's so intense. And it's going to call you into an action by using an emotion.
Welcome to the Break Free Podcast. I am your host, David Mancella. This podcast is dedicated to interview amazing leaders in business that are changing the world for a better place. Today we have with us Dr. Don Wood. I met Don about 6-7 months ago in one of our masterminds, business masterminds, and his business is incredible. It's adding amazing value to the world by helping people with mental health. So, Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. Great to see you again.
Very nice to see you too. For the audience, can you tell me your full name? Where do you live and what do you do for a living?
Yeah, so it's Dr. Don Wood, Donald Wood. I live in Orlando, Florida, and a number of years ago started a program called the Inspired Performance Institute to work with people who are suffering from trauma in particular. But as you can tell from the title of the company, it's really focused on performance. And what I talk about is that when we have this unresolved trauma, it actually affects our performance levels. So even for high performing athletes, executives, people like that, if you can get that trauma released, right, you can actually perform at a higher level.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's at some level, a lot of people suffer eventually from trauma, right? It could be childhood trauma, or it could be adolescence, or even adulthood trauma, right? When big things happen in our lives that we are not in control of, they tend to make a big wound in our hearts and in our minds, and then we're almost walking wounded throughout life, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly what it is, especially when you have childhood trauma, because children are actually not very experienced in life. So when they get a traumatic event in their life, they attach a lot of meanings to it. What does it mean about my safety, my self-worth, right? All of those kinds of things. So if you've had no childhood trauma, but you get adult trauma, right, that will affect it a little bit differently, but it still affects us. And then it also affects actually the way our DNA is transcribed and read. So I just wrote my newest book, and I called it Don't Mess With My DNA. And the idea behind it is, when children are growing up, you need to be aware of how sensitive they are to language and tone and messaging. And so even with the best of intentions, parents can have an effect on their child by saying the wrong thing or saying something that they think your child understands, but they don't. And It's amazing how those things show up later in life, David. I mean, I see it all the time in health issues, right? In performance issues. It definitely is going to show up somewhere.
And it's incredible that everybody has a different path in life, and some of us are more affected than others, right? For example, I just discovered last year that I had ADHD and I didn't know. And I felt like almost like, there was a light shining from heaven, showing me why I was doing some of the things that I was doing, which a lot of them allowed me to become successful in business. But some of them were actually hurting my family in a negative way, because of my compulsive behavior, right?
Did you have stress as a child when you were growing up, a stressful home?
Yeah. I had my mom died when I was 2.5 years old, and then I had to go live with my grandparents. They separated me from my other siblings, so I guess that had a big implication when I was growing up.
So that's one of the things that I talk about, like ADD and ADHD, right, is actually a function of the brain. It's not a dysfunction of the brain. They keep referring to it that there's something wrong. Oh, I have ADHD or ADD. What I talk about is it's actually the way the brain, it's brilliant. So if you're growing up as a child and you're in a very stressful environment, right, children are not equipped to handle stress, especially children. So as an adult, as you and I are sitting here talking, if we disagree on something, you have two options. You can argue with me, fight back, or you can walk away. So you have fight or flight options, right? A child has neither. So as a 2.5-year-old, you can't fight back against the stress. You can't leave the stress. So you live in it, you sit in it. So how does the brain protect itself? It literally does this. It shuts down, it tunes out, it stops focusing so that it doesn't have to absorb as much stress. Now you take that child and you stick them into a learning environment like school, and they have trouble, right?
Yeah.
The reason they have trouble is because they, during the most formative years of brain training between the ages of 0 and 7, they had trained their brain to tune out, shut down, stop focusing. Now we can't figure out why they can't focus when they get to school. Well, it was training, right?
Yeah.
So what do? They immediately put the children on medication to try to focus. And literally what they're putting them on is speed. They're making the brain go so much faster so it has to focus. So it's almost like they're just sticking on a wire, right, to speed everything up. Well, that's not the best solution. The best solution is to take a little more time and train the brain to learn how to focus. And I read in your book that you figured that out on your own. Because what I was reading is when you talked about when you were in school, when you were younger, all of a sudden you decided you wanted to be a pilot, right? And so you talked to your dad about being a pilot. And so school was not a high priority for you. You're like I said, a C student. But as soon as you became interested in something, you could focus again. That's what entrepreneurs are, right? So they learn how to focus. So, but as a child, they weren't stimulating you. They weren't getting your attention. There was nothing of real interest to you. But as soon as you figured out what you wanted to do and you had a strong interest, now you're able to focus, and all of a sudden now you become a good student.
Yeah, and it was crazy. Like my dad had to encourage me to get good marks, and I was failing. But as soon as I fell in love with flying airplanes, I became the best student in my class.
That's the focus ability. You always had that ability, right? But the problem is growing up during those formative years, you had trained your brain not to focus. That's why when you got to school, it was harder to focus. But as soon as you got the ability, you had something that you could focus on, you did it. So we train children differently. We don't have to keep medicating them. All we have to do is train their brain to be able to stay in focus. And that's possible. The brain's has tremendous plasticity. It can change dramatically as long as it's trained properly. And so we spend the rest of our lives learning how to do things. Now you can train it however you want. You can train it to be negative. You can train it to be positive. You can train it to tune out. You can train it to hyper focus. Whatever you want to do. But it's all based on, for a child growing up in a traumatic household. My wife struggled in school as well, but she came from a very stressful, traumatic childhood. And when I first met her, she said, I don't really get good grades. She didn't feel like she was very smart. And I always thought, I don't really think that's true. I think this is before I knew what I'm doing now. I always thought that she was pretty smart because as soon as I was a straight A student, but I had no trauma. I had nothing that was stressing me out. So of course I could focus. She looked at my report cards one time from school and she goes, wow, school must have been so easy for you. And I went, well, of course it's easy. I'm not worried about what happened to me last night at home. I don't have to worry what's going to happen when I get home today.
Right.
I said, you had nowhere to land. you're in a constant state of flight. So how can you focus when you're in that constant state of stress? As soon as I started showing her some techniques on how to study and memorize, she was like, why has nobody ever taught me this? Like, it made it so much easier. She's my best researcher now. She's phenomenal.
That's amazing. So you were saying that like when you met her and she was doing this, you were not doing what you were doing now. So what got you into become like a professional for mental health issues?
It was really my daughter. So I knew what my wife was struggling with, but she was a great mom, great wife. So she was struggling with fear. But it wasn't like she didn't get into drugs or alcohol. She was just always living with this fear and insecurity that something was going to go wrong, something was going to crash, even though we were doing really well, financially. We lived in Toronto as well. So
really? That's amazing.
And so when we were living up there, we had a good business. We had 3 beautiful children, a beautiful home, but she was always worried about when's it going to crash, because that was her experience as a child. And then it was really my daughter, when she turned 14, was diagnosed with Crohn's. And that started the process of going, where's the Crohn's coming from? And then which is autoimmune. And then she developed a second autoimmune disorder called idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, which is where the iron in the blood gets released. The immune system releases the iron overload. So literally her lungs would start filling up with blood. That's when my wife said to me, you need to figure this out or we're going to lose our daughter. Wow. So I started to look for solutions to it. And what I discovered was when we have unresolved trauma, which we didn't know my daughter had, so she didn't disclose it to us until she was older. This undisclosed, unresolved trauma, right, was the running on a loop. And it creates inflammation in the body, which compromises the immune system and the neurotransmitters. And so at the time, I didn't know that, but through my research, I figured it out. And then figured out a way, and again, they just taught her to live and manage and cope with both of these things. Mm-hmm. I said, why aren't they fixing it, right? And you're in the software business. It would be equivalent to somebody coming to you saying, yeah, we have this glitch in the software. Can you write a workaround, to the software glitch? You would say, no, let's fix the glitch.
Yeah, let's remove the obstacle and rewrite it.
And that's the analogy I sort of use with what I did is they were teaching people to write another code around it, right? To try to live and manage and deal with it. And I use the analogy all the time. It's like if every time you touch the M key on your computer shut off, right? So if you took your computer to your computer therapist, right? Yeah. Your computer therapist would say, don't touch the M key. Stay away from words with M's in them. Don't write any words that has an M. Otherwise you're going to shut off the computer. You, with your knowledge, you would just say, no, let's just fix the code.
Yeah, so make the M, not the off button.
It's not what they're doing in mental health. They're teaching everybody to, oh, you have anxiety? Okay, we're going to give you anti-anxiety meds. Or no, we're going to train you on how to live with your anxiety. That's like training you how to live without writing M's.
So what did you go to school for? So you were basically motivated to go back to school just for your daughter to help you?
I went back just for this. So it wasn't until my 50s I went back and got my PhD in clinical counseling, clinical psychology. And I did the clinical part so that I could really focus on the research.
Right.
So I did a lot of research. So even though I was learning everything I needed to learn to get my degree, I was saying I'm looking for a solution, right? Not to necessarily practice everything that was being done. So I was coming into it as an entrepreneur, right? And we know as entrepreneurs, right, we figure out solutions to niche problems, right? Yeah. And that's what I was looking for.
So before that, you had your own business then, before you went back to school?
Yeah, I've always been an entrepreneur. So I was in the financial services business. I was an entrepreneur. So I've always done sort of business stuff. And so when this sort of came along, I said, okay, well, I need to figure out a solution like I would with any business. There's a problem. Let's figure out a way to fix it.
That is amazing, and not just patch it, but actually, like you said, remove the obstacle and create a brand new highway. What I find fascinating from you and the rest of, at least of the people, the professionals that I know, is that, so for example, with my condition, I went right away to a psychologist. I realized that wasn't enough, so I ended up with a psychoanalyst, and he really, really helped managing, like not managing the condition, but helped me to use it as a weapon instead of using it as something that was hurting me. So now my life is 10 times better. It even allowed me to go back to faith. I'm a born again Christian, and I left the faith for a long time, and all that was because of my impulsive behavior, right? I started traveling impulsively. I started setting myself goals, financial goals, that when I reached them, it left me more empty than what I was before. Yeah. Little did I know that a big part of that was the ADHD, right? The one thing my psychoanalyst told me was that the condition doesn't excuse me from the behavior, the wrong behavior, right? He says, if that was the case, we wouldn't have psychopaths in jail. Right. Right? Yep. But he really helped me set myself into a true path, into a path of using everything that I have the way my brain is to make it for good, 100% for good. Like before, maybe it was 50% for good, 50% I was lost. Now everything is for good. So, I'm restoring relationship with my wife, with my kids. I'm recovering all those lost years where I was basically checked out from my house, just looking for material abundance. And with that extreme intensity, because in my case, I went from not being able to focus at all to do hyper focusing. So, for example, looking back at my book, when I decided I wanted to become an airplane pilot, it was so intense that all it was, I had to get those grades in order to go into military school, because very few people got in. So I actually got in, and if you compare that to all the years before, I was barely getting by in school, so they wouldn't kick me out. But I transferred that to my life. When I started my own business, it was the same thing, like laser focus. I forget about the rest. I don't care how people feel until I accomplish my goal.
Well, that was because that was the way your brain was trained early on, was to tune out everything else. So but when you had to focus, you could become hyper-focused. You always had that ability. So you actually became hyper-focused in tuning out. Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? So all of a sudden now, if they can't stimulate you, so you're as a child, you're sitting in a classroom and they're not giving you anything that makes you go, I really love this, I'm passionate about this. Your brain would tune that out.
Yeah.
It's how it survived the stress of your childhood. But at any time, everybody is capable of doing what you did, is becoming hyper-focused. And as soon as you got something that you became passionate about, you always had that ability. That's what made you a good entrepreneur. So you had sort of on and off switches, right? So when it was off, it was off. And when it was on, it was on, right? Mm-hmm. Where a lot of people sort of have a gradual, they go from 0 to 60, right? You are at 0 or at 60, right? That was the way
I couldn't find the balance in my life. And it's crazy because now, for example, like right now I am sitting in a desk. I've been sitting in this desk for 2 months, and that's normal for people, right? For me, it's not normal. Since the pandemic started, I actually started walking. I bought a walking desk, and my 2 miles a day walk while I was working became 20 miles a day, to the point that I developed extreme anemia last year. The doctor told me to stop walking. Yep. That's how my behavior was before, because I didn't know I had ADHD, so I didn't know I could actually control my behavior.
Totally control it. Right? And that's what I'm saying. It's all in training. We need, instead of medicating it, we need to train it. Once you understood what the problem was, that's why what I spent in the program that I work on with people, during our, TIP program, is I spend 2 hours. It's a 4-hour program. I spend the first 2 hours on the education and science, because once you understand, when I say to everybody when they come in, there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with your mind. your mind is responding to events and experiences that you have experienced throughout your lifetime. So your mind is going to create patterns and codes, right, about that. And I always talk about, think of the brain, the physical brain as the computer, and the mind is the software, right? So this makes sense for you, right? So if I take my computer and I drop it, the brain, I'm going to damage it, right? But the software is prone to glitches and error messages, right? In the way it codes. So all you have to do is go in there and start looking at where the coding errors are coming in, right? And then just write new code. And we can all do it. And that's why I said nothing wrong with anybody.
It's incredible. Like, I remember the things I allowed things to torment me a lot of my life. And that's what I said when I got diagnosed, when I realized what this was. It's funny because 2 years ago, I went for dinner with another friend of mine, and he had it for a long time, and he has a podcast about it for awareness. We sat down for dinner for 2 hours, and he said, "You have it." And I didn't believe him. It's like, you're crazy, right? And then it took 2 more years until God allowed me to actually realize that I actually had it. I almost had to break my marriage with my misbehavior in order for me to realize that I had this condition. And but it's incredible. I tell you all these things because, well, like you said, like, you can rewire your brain, like you can retrain your brain. For example, right now, when I had this, let's talk about sitting down, because like sitting down is such a simple thing for normal people, but for people like me that is super hyperactive, it requires an effort. So basically what I do, this is what's been working for me. Again, I'm a person of faith and I'm Christian. So what I do is, once I feel the anxiety coming in because I need to do something, I just surrender my thoughts to God. And then, Lord, please take this. Jesus, take my thoughts. And I don't let them go through that neural pathway that I had.
Yes.
I stop it. I surrender it to my Lord and Savior. And by doing that, I know God is creating a new neural pathway in my brain. So what's happening now, after doing this for over 3 months now, I have to do it less and less because the anxiety doesn't come as strong anymore.
There you go. That's it. Well,
Isn't that crazy?
You built new codes. I talk about the same thing when people say to me with addiction, they have addiction. I say, addiction is a symptom. It's not what you have. Addiction is a code. So if you had emotional or physical pain, and every day you were dealing with this pain, and then you found drugs or alcohol, for example, right? And that solved the pain temporarily. Every time you use that substance, your brain was building a code for you, and it runs off the code. So the first thing we have to do is work on what originally caused the pain, which is the trauma, the traumatic event. It could be a physical or a sexual assault, or, being bullied, or whatever it is. We need to get that reset and then work on the codes, which is what you're doing right now, is you're recoding your brain to be able to default, right, from the old pattern to the new pattern. And just like, and I love the computer analogy. You're the perfect guy I'm not explaining anything you don't already know. But if you write code, the code is going to override the old code when it gets entrenched, right? And so you can rewrite code.
That's beautiful. When you were in your research days, when you were getting your PhD, do you have a specific moment in your life where you realized this is what it is and this is how to fix it? How did that happen?
It really came, like I said, every time I turned around, and I'm God believing too. I think God just kept showing me things, right? Because I'll talk to people and say, "Have you ever heard of this?" They'll go, "No, never heard." And I'm like, "Wow!" Just things started showing up in research on me, right? For example, one of the things that I discovered was something called the time slice theory, and I was like. And it was really funny, David. It was in a research article, but it was only about 2 sentences in this whole research article. And I remember highlighting it. And I don't know what made me highlight it, but I wanted to remember to go and do more research on that. And what the time slice theory says, it was developed by 2 scientists at the University of Zurich. that asked the question, is consciousness streaming? And what they meant by that is you and I are talking here. This feels like it's just a continuous flow of information. However, it's not. Your subconscious mind, it's flowing. So your subconscious mind takes in all the information in real time, processes it, and then sends time slices like clips from a movie reel to your conscious mind. Your subconscious is 95% running everything. Your conscious mind is 5%. So your subconscious can take in all this detail, process it, and then sends pieces of that information to your conscious mind. But there's a 400 millionth of a second gap in between the slices, which means your subconscious is responding 400 millionths of a second before you're consciously aware of it.
Wow.
That totally explained everything to me, because I said, what's happening in that 400 millionths of a second is if you're in a situation and this information is coming in and something looks like, sounds like, feels like you've experienced in your life, like a traumatic event. When your mind takes in that and subconscious takes that in, it's processing it and doing a Google search. What do we know about this information? Have we seen it before, experienced it before? And if it looks like or sounds like something that you had been hurt by before, it activates the nervous system below your conscious awareness. And that's why people can understand, why am I feeling anxiety? Why am I feeling anger? Right? There's nothing happening. I'm sitting here just thinking about something, and instantly they become angry or anxious. It's the Google search during that 400 millionth of a second.
And you're not even aware that it's happening.
No. So that's why, I wrote a patent, and I got a patent on panic attacks, because that's exactly what a panic attack is. So about an hour before you experience a panic attack, the subconscious mind is already looping through this stuff, looking for the danger, but it can't find the danger because you're not in danger, but it's looking at the old information in real time, thinking that there's a danger. So while that's building up, physiologically, the body's starting to prepare for fight or flight, but you're not conscious of it. You're not feeling your heart pounding yet. So it's slowly building. And when your mind can't find the lion, so to speak, right, the danger, right, and yet it's getting physiological symptoms that things are changing, it hits a panic attack button. And the people will say the panic attack came on instantly, but it didn't come on instantly. It was developing over the last hour. So what I now have is, we have a tool that you'll use. It'll measure oxygen intake and oxygen saturation. So, and this will make more sense if people have gone through our program. I can alert you that a panic attack is on its way, and I've taught you how to shut it down.
Oh,
so you shut it down before it starts.
That's amazing. That's incredible. Yep. How long have you been helping people, Don?
Since 2013 is when I really started to put the program out there and kept refining it. And really launched around 2015. So it's been, the last almost 10 years.
So I guess you have seen everything and anything.
And it's funny because people will come in and they'll have this, I'm just a very depressed person, or I'm a very anxious person. And I just come back with, no, that's just a symptom. That's not the problem. The problem isn't the anxiety. The problem isn't the depression.
Yeah.
Depression is a function of the brain, not a dysfunction. Just like ADHD is a function of the brain. If you look at it as a function, doesn't it make sense that we can fix it? Right? Everything is a function of the brain. The brain is never, ever going to hurt you. So when people say to me, oh, I sabotage myself all the time, the first thing I say to them is, it's impossible. The brain is survival based, right? God would not put in a sabotage, tool, right? That's impossible.
Yeah.
We're not capable of sabotage, right? So the brain will always try to figure out a way to protect you. And because your subconscious mind operates in the present, when does it want the pain to stop? Now. So when people take drugs or alcohol, they stop the pain now. So it solved the problem. Because your subconscious has no connection to time, it can't see consequences to an action, right? Because it doesn't see a second from now or a second before. It only sees now. So this is solving the problem now. So when people talk about suicide, right? Isn't suicide sabotage? I go, no, it's not. Suicide is a solution to pain. It's not about wanting to die. It's about wanting to stop the pain.
Stop the pain.
Yeah. And so because if I take my life right now, did I accomplish the target? Yes, I stopped the pain. The subconscious mind doesn't see the consequence to death. It's just a solution to the problem. So when I work with people who say, well, I have suicidal thoughts, I'll say, I don't believe that you want to die. I believe that you've got pain and you haven't figured out a way to stop the pain.
Yeah.
So you've run out of options, you run out of resources. What if we could show you a way to stop the pain, which will then stop the thought about suicide?
And again, you go after the root cause, not the symptoms, right? Yeah. The root cause is what's creating the symptoms, and the symptoms are being made by the subconscious minds. Brilliant. You know, in my case, I call them, you know, all those symptoms, all those tormenting thoughts, I call them demons. Because what a demon is something that comes and torments you, right? And then you try to get away from that tormenting thought, and maybe you have relief for a little bit, and then it comes back again and it torments you again. I remember I was trapped with all these different things that were tormenting me, all in my head, right? You know, the Bible says that the battle is in the mind. It's clear that it says that the battle is in the mind.
Romans 12:2, renewal of the mind.
Exactly. Yes.
Through the mind, which is what we're doing. We're rebooting the computer because it's glitchy, right? And so that's what I always talk to people. Anytime you have an emotion, right? Fear, anger, whatever it is, your mind is calling for an action. So these symptoms, we're treating all the symptoms. The purpose of fear is to escape a threat. The purpose of anger is to attack a threat. The problem is that your mind is looking at old information, calling for actions that aren't possible. So then your mind will then start to get your attention by making you very anxious, right? It's not a problem. It's not trying to create a problem for you. It's trying to create an action for you, but you're not responding. So it ratchets it up. What looks like a demon is not a demon. It's your mind saying, right, David, don't let your mother die, right? Don't let the pain from your childhood, right, come in. It's trying to prevent something from happening that already happened. It's a glitch.
You know, it's crazy. When I asked my psychotherapist, why does he do that? You know, what he does. You know what he told me? He told me Matthew 5:7, more specifically, it's the Sermon on the Mount. And he says, in the version of the Bible that I have, he says, blessed are those that have their mind and their heart clean and pure, because they shall see God in the world.
Right.
And he said, when I read that, I became a psychoanalyst. And I'm like, whoa. And it's true, right? Like once you're able to clear your mind, to purify your mind, your heart responds, which is where your emotions are, and they are aligned, and then you're in a blissful state.
The only reason your mind uses an emotion is to call for an action. The question is what's it calling an action for? Mm-hmm. So when people have post-traumatic stress, their mind is looking at, let's just take, for example, a war veteran, for example. I worked with a guy, U.S. Army sniper, who had to shoot and kill a 12-year-old boy. He was ordered, right? He's a sniper. The boy was firing at the troops. So they ordered him to take him out. So for 8 years, he's suffering. And he said, I just can't live with myself anymore for what I did. And so he said, they just keep medicating me. And he says, I can't live like this. By the time I was finished the 4-hour session, right, he was able to give me a complete description of what happened that day without shaking and crying. And he said to me, he goes, how did you do this? How am I able to talk about it without that fear anymore? And I said, what happened is for the last 8 years, your mind has been trying to get you not to pull the trigger. It's been calling for an action, but the action isn't possible. Your mind sees trauma in real time. All we have to do is reset that traumatic memory. And the way I explain it is, so David, if I asked you what you ate for dinner last night, can you tell me what you ate for dinner?
Chicken and fries.
So when I asked you that, you saw pictures, right, of what you ate.
Yeah.
Probably maybe where you ate it. That's how you stored the information about dinner last night. It wasn't traumatic or disturbing, so it's stored as a fairly low resolution file. Had that been a traumatic event, all your senses are heightened, sight, smell, hearing. It's going to record that in high definition with tremendous amounts of details to it. Whenever your mind recalls that traumatic information, it thinks it's happening now. It's so intense. And it's going to call you into an action by using an emotion. Make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
So what we're going to do, and what I take people through, is we're going to take that high definition traumatic memory and get your mind, and your mind will do it, to reprocess it into the same format as what you ate for dinner last night. Not as intense. Your mind can look at that data without feeling there's an action involved. And then that's why he could describe it in complete detail.
So basically, you are taking the negative emotional charge away from the memory. So there is just a plain black and white memory that they're already.
So it's not even the emotional charge. What it is we're taking the high definition memory. So this very bright, intense, the emotion, remember, is a response to that.
Okay, got it.
That response doesn't show up, right, unless it thinks there's a threat. So when we take the intensity out of it, so we take it from a high definition to say black and white, right? Just to make it simple. When your mind sees the black and white, it doesn't call for the emotion. The emotion is a response. It's not connected to it. That's a really fine distinction, right? Your mind would never call for an emotion or an action unless it felt there was something needed. So the emotion doesn't attach to the memory brings in the emotion.
Okay, I get it now. So you have the memory, you have the mind triggering the wrong emotions. And in this case, for example, people run to alcohol or drugs to kill the emotion.
That's it.
So that they could stop the pain. Yes. But you have to get at the root cause, which is the mind, and how the mind is processing that information so that it doesn't give you the wrong emotions.
Exactly.
Brilliant.
That's simple, right? And that's why, we can heal all this stuff. There's nothing wrong with anybody. So what you were experiencing as a child with this stress that you were growing up in is you were storing a lot of high resolution files. And how did your mind protect you from that? Let's tune out.
Right.
So it's our minds are brilliant. God created us brilliantly, right, to protect ourselves. And so that was the way that your mind figured out a way to respond to it. So all we have to do is reset the memory. And we can do that. That's the renewal of the mind. We're going to stop the mind from looking at that high resolution. We're not going to stop it from seeing it. We're going to stop it from seeing the high intensity to it.
Yeah.
And then it won't call for the action. It's just information about something. What do we need to do about World War II? Nothing. Better it never happened. We're not going for happy about it. We're just trying to stop. You imagine if somebody was sitting there saying, I really need to stop Hitler right now. We can't stop Hitler right now. Hitler doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Right? But if the mind kept reviewing that high definition data about World War II, it would call for an action.
That's beautiful. You know, the power of forgiveness. I have been using that, asking for forgiveness for what I've done wrong, and also forgiving people that has done wrong with me. And somehow, you know, when I said my process, where I throw my thoughts into God, into the feet of God, and says, "Please take this from me," and I basically stop my brain from running that old neural pathway. When I do the forgiveness process and it's truly sincere, it just happens exponentially. It's just a lot faster. The healing is a lot faster. Have you experienced that too?
Yeah, our mind and bodies are designed to heal, right? What's interfering with the healing is if the mind's in a constant state of fight or flight, it's not going to do maintenance. It's trying to escape the threats. So if your mind believes that there's a lion chasing you because it's reviewing all this old data, it's not going to want to stop for a second to do maintenance. It's going to want to escape. And so if your mind is in that constant state of fight or flight, which was what's happening to my wife growing up in a traumatic childhood, I had none of that. So I had maximum maintenance and healing. I've had that all my life. I've been healthy all my life. I believe it was because my nervous system was trained, right, to stay in a regulated state. I can get bumped, I can get agitated, right? But my brain learned from a childhood to come back into regulation because I lived in a safe environment. So I was always coming home to safety. I was always coming home to this very nurturing, loving home. So if I got bumped at school or at a game that day, as soon as I came home, my mind went back into I'm safe, right?
And you're probably one in a million because you're an anomaly, right?
Yeah, I thought I didn't know that. I thought everybody had my life. It really wasn't until I met my wife that I went, oh my gosh, this is really different. It wasn't different. That was the norm.
But what a blessing that the Lord used you and your safety and the way that you were brought up and got you together with your wife and then your daughter, and used that for you to get training, and it gave you the knowledge and the wisdom so that you can now help other people. Isn't that unconditional love of God? Isn't that amazing?
You knew even more of the story. I was adopted. So I was adopted at birth. So I always knew I was adopted. And I was very happy. I never had any really burning desire to know. The only thing that my mother told me, and it wasn't until I was 18, it was that our family doctor was my grandfather. But that's all I knew. So he came to my parents to adopt me. And it wasn't until about over a year and a half ago, we had our first grandchild. So my daughter decided to do the DNA. And I found out I have 6 siblings.
Wow.
3 that were born before me, 3 that were born after me. And the 3 that were born before me, my mother lived in a home with a very violent father, husband, right? It was constant beatings, addiction, right? Horrible. She walked out and left the family. This is before I was born. Then obviously got pregnant with me, couldn't raise me on her own. So Dr. Rowley, right, got me adopted by my parents. The 3 siblings that were born before me all had addiction issues. 2 died from cancer, 1 is still suffering from heart disease.
Wow.
And I've had none of it. The 3 that were born after me, 1 has died, 1 is currently dying, and the other one, but all 3 of them had addiction issues. David, I've never touched a drink in my life, never touched a drug in my life, ever once.
Yeah.
So when they say that addiction is genetic, I go,
Nope.
Not necessarily, it's environment.
Yeah.
Environment is what creates it. Pain is what creates it. We need to stop shaming and guilting these people that they're bad and they're broken. They're not. They're hurt.
You're hurt. It's the pain behind. And see how the Lord separated you from your destiny. Absolutely. And he protected you.
This perfect spot. My wife goes, we were the perfect petri dishes for this because I at least knew the model, right? And the thing that was fascinating, I was born at a private maternity hospital. There's no way my mother could have afforded that. So somebody was taking care of me, may have been my grandfather or somebody. So I was adopted at birth, born in this private maternity hospital. Before it was a maternity hospital, this is what I just found out a year and a half ago. It was a wellness center doing what I do.
No way. Oh, wow.
Is that not amazing? People came from all over the world to go to this wellness center.
Wow.
Right? And then the hospital took over and became a hospital. But before it was that, it was a wellness center working on nervous system disorders. Exactly what I do. That's not coincidence.
What happened to your daughter after you became a doctor?
Once we got the trauma resolved, no Crohn's, right? No lung disorder, both.
Oh my God. So she's free.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you realize that in a way you are actually performing deliverance on people. You're liberating them from their demons, from their pain, from their traumas, their behaviors. This is beautiful. Congratulations.
It was all led. I don't take any of the credit. It was God and my wife and my daughter that really showed me the way.
Beautiful. I am so happy we were able to meet. It's also not a coincidence. This podcast is for you, but more for the world. The people need to know about you so that they can get their healing, because basically you're healing people. And now we have the science to know that mental health creates all kinds of other illnesses, all kinds of problems, because, right?
None of the illnesses are coming from psychological.
How many?
80%.
80%. Imagine that. But it makes sense if you say that you don't have time for maintenance. Right. All you're doing is fighting and escaping away. You don't have time for your body to regenerate or to heal what's going wrong in your system, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Fantastic. Doctor, thank you so much for being in the show. I don't want to overstep your time. I think we need to do another session. We need to have more examples, if you like. We need to shine the light on people. People are suffering all over the place. I feel so free now, after God allowed me to see why I was doing what I was doing. He healed me through many different people. They say that we are the fingers of God, right? And I believe that now it's our time to actually show people the light, that there is an option, there is a way out, and that they don't have to go back to their wrong behaviors and their compulsive behaviors in order to avoid pain, that there is a way out.
I agree. Perfect. Thanks so much, David, for having me on.
Don, so people can find you, where can they find you online if they if they want to go to see you?
Yeah, so it's called the Inspired with a D, performanceinstitute.com. And you can go to that and you'll read all about what we do and how we do it. There's a ton of testimonials on there of people who have gone from, panic attacks, anxiety, depression, addiction. So just check it out and see what you think. And then you can always call and talk to one of our people and they'll guide you all the way through how the program works.
Wonderful. Everybody, Dr. Don Wood over here, I highly recommend you find him if you're suffering from all these horrible feelings and pains and cycles and loops. I used to be one of those guys. I am now free. And God is using Dr. Don in a great way. So thank you for being in the show, Doctor. One last question before we go. If you had access to a billboard in front of the busiest highway on earth, what would you write in it?
There's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with your mind.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Doctor. God bless you, and I'll have a beautiful rest of the week.
You too. Thanks so much, David.
That's all for today's episode of the Break Free Podcast. Head on over to iTunes and subscribe to the show. Starting your own business can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. Visit davidmansilla.com to pick up a copy of the #1 international best-selling book, Breaking Out of Corporate Jail. Expand what you consider to be possible and reach your full potential. And join us on the next episode.